America, now a melting pot of religious diversity, has a distinctly Christian heritage. But even with this framework, there's another heritage, deep in the roots of the American Constitution and Republican form of government. This heritage is Reformed theology, otherwise known as Calvinism, which emphasizes the sovereignty of God over all things. In the infancy of America, religion and politics were inseparable, and the purpose of this project is to explore how a distinctly Calvinistic theology, specifically the doctrines of covenantalism, total depravity, and God's sovereignty, shaped the ideological foundations of the early American Republic. It is important to make a distinction at the beginning that not all of America's founders were Calvinists. They weren't even all Christian, but the heritage and influence of Calvinism was pervasive and demonstrable. As Greg Koukl observes, over 70% of the Constitutional Convention was made up of Calvinists. It is also important to credit the Enlightenment ideals that certainly influenced the early Republic, but it was Calvinism specifically that provided the basic theological foundation for key political concepts, such as the rejection of rule by divine right, limited self-government, of the people, by the people, for the people, and the system of checks and balances and separation of powers. And this understanding is crucial today as America drifts more towards a secular worldview, often overlooking or outright denying the heritage that shaped its very existence. Well, to understand the importance and influence of Calvinism, we must first travel back in time. In 16th century Europe, following in the footsteps of reformers such as Martin Luther, John Calvin's theology emerged as a transformative force. In his magnum opus work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin laid out a systematic theological framework emphasizing God's absolute sovereignty as well as man's total depravity or sinfulness. Calvin would go on to formulate a doctrinal understanding of government and the magistrate, that human institutions were to be accountable to God and His holy law. Now, it's difficult to really express the total influence of Calvin's theological work, but it is certain that his theology did inspire political thinkers such as Samuel Rutherford, whose work Lex Rex built upon Calvin's ideas to challenge the divine right of kings, instead arguing that rulers must be bound by the same covenants and laws as the people who are governed. Now, this might seem like common sense today, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was considered radical. It challenged the status quo, and it planted the seeds of resistance and kingly accountability that would take root far beyond the borders of Europe. These radical and revolutionary ideas would cross the Atlantic Ocean with a group of religious settlers called the Puritans. The Puritans traveled to the New World for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which was fleeing religious persecution and to worship God as they saw fit. They braved the open ocean in a less than ideal season to travel, seeking to build a society based upon the Bible and their faith. And the faith they brought with them to the shores of what would become America was Calvinism. This deeply God-centered theology led leaders such as John Winthrop in his 1630 sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, to envision and proclaim the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a city upon a hill, a covenant community committed to one another and with mutual obligation to glorify their God. And this wasn't just spiritual, this reached into the very first political theory on the shores of the New World, and it set the stage for a new kind of government that was rooted in biblical and distinctly Calvinistic principles. At the heart of these principles were three key Calvinist doctrines: covenantalism, total depravity, and God's sovereignty. These weren't just abstract ivory tower theological or philosophical musings. These were concrete biblical realities with practical implications that translated directly into the political theory that shaped America's development. Covenantalism, while a complex doctrinal framework, basically views society as operating within a series of mutual, contractual, or covenantal agreements, giving rise to the idea of consent of governance. In other words, of the people, by the people, for the people. While Calvinists understand, according to Joel Beeke in A Puritan Theology, that human nature is corrupted by sin, All humans are on equal footing. God is the only sovereign ruler, and he alone rules by divine right. The rest of mankind commits in covenant agreements, but it is with an understanding of basic equality. Total depravity is another Calvinistic doctrine that shaped early American political theory. Essentially, that mankind has a fallen, sinful nature, that every part of a person, emotion, mind, and will, are all affected by sin. Now, that is not to say that a person is as bad as he possibly could be, but that every part of him is tainted or corrupted with sin. This view necessitates the limits on power and government authority to prevent the inevitable tyranny that would follow. James Madison, influenced by Calvinist principles, wrote in the Federalist Papers number 37. Madison states, "The history of almost all the great councils and consultations held among mankind for reconciling their discordant opinion is a history of factions, contentions, and disappointments, and may be classed among the most dark and degraded pictures which display the infirmities and depravities of the human character." The final doctrine underneath this study is that of God's sovereignty, that God has absolute authority over all things. This inspired the Puritans as well as the Founding Fathers to appreciate this nation as a divine mandate, a God-ordained land that would be used to glorify Him and accomplish His purposes. It also, understanding God's authority, provided the moral foundation for obedience to the new government, as well as a resistance to unjust rule and tyranny. Together, these three doctrines would form the foundational framework that would guide the colonies from their earliest days in the Massachusetts Bay to the founding of the United States of America. The origin of this framework harkens back to 1620, with one of the first expressions of covenantal self-government not only in America, but in the world. This is the Mayflower Compact. As the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, they drafted a very practical application of their Calvinistic understanding of covenantalism, a compact pledging to create a civil body politic for the common good and for the glory of God. This covenantalism is also visible through Winthrop's sermon, mentioned earlier, delivered aboard the Arbella. He called for a society rooted in love, justice, and a shared, collective responsibility. This would influence not only the local Massachusetts Bay Colony, but New England in general. A vision of a godly community with a self-governing body, balancing individual liberty with communal duty. Just 19 short years later, these ideals were institutionalized in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This important document laid further groundwork by establishing a representative government with limited authority. Drafted by Calvinist Puritans, it reflected both covenantalism as well as total depravity, and was a milestone in the application of Calvinist theological principles on the American government and political structure. Fast forward more than 100 years through revivals and awakenings as the crescendo of Calvinist influence bears on the American Revolution. In the 1770s, tensions rose with England, and Presbyterian clergy, strong Orthodox Calvinists, took the lead in framing the resistance as a moral duty. The historian Bancroft writes the Revolution of 1776, so far as it was affected by religion, was a Presbyterian measure. It was the natural outgrowth of the principles which the Presbyterianism of the Old World planted in her sons. The English Puritans, the Scotch Covenanters, the French Huguenots, the Dutch Calvinists, and the Presbyterians of Ulster. To which Lorraine Botner expresses, history is eloquent in declaring that American democracy was born of Christianity and that Christianity was Calvinism. The great revolutionary conflict which resulted in the formation of the American nation was carried out mainly by Calvinists, many of whom had been trained in the rigidly Presbyterian College at Princeton, and this nation is their gift to all liberty-loving people. Pastors like Jonathan Mayhew, leading up to the Revolution, inspiring patriots by drawing on God's sovereignty. Obedience to tyrants was disobedience to God. This galvanized and solidified support for independence, demonstrating how theology was blending with politics. Finally, we arrive in 1787 to the United States Constitution. While not a theological document in any sense, it was riddled with Calvinist theological principles, especially regarding the anthropology or doctrines of man. Enshrined in the Constitution is a system of checks and balances. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must, first, enable the government to control the governed, and the next place, oblige it to control itself. Directly related to the Calvinist understanding of human nature, that all people are not inherently good, but are corrupted to the core by sin, led to the fundamental recognition that no single person or group could be trusted with absolute power and authority. This system of separation of powers and checks and balances became a cornerstone of the American Republic experiment. From the very earliest days of the Mayflower Compact through the American Revolution and ratification of the Constitution, Calvinism, both directly and indirectly, has sown a coherent and consistent thread throughout America's political evolution. Beginning in Europe with Luther, Calvin, Rutherford, and others, it crossed the Atlantic with the Puritans and took root in compacts, covenants, sermons, revolutions, and constitutions. Calvinism and its doctrines of covenantalism, total depravity, and God's sovereignty provided the framework that shaped early American republicanism, including the rejection of rule by divine right and the system of checks and balances. As America continues today to drift towards secularism, these religious roots are more important than ever. It has been well said that when we come to study the influence of Calvinism as a political force in the history of the United States, we come to one of the brightest pages of all Calvinistic history. Calvinism came to America in the Mayflower, and Bancroft, the greatest of American historians, pronounces the Pilgrim Fathers Calvinist in their faith according to the straightest system. John Endicott, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, the second governor of that colony, Thomas Hooker, the founder of Connecticut, John Davenport, the founder of the New Haven Colony, and Roger Williams, the founder of the Rhode Island Colony, were all Calvinists. William Penn was a disciple of the Huguenots. It is estimated that of the 3 million Americans at the time of the American Revolution, 900,000 were of Scotch or Scotch-Irish origins, 600,000 were Puritan English, and 400,000 were German or Dutch Reformed. In addition to this, the Episcopalians had a Calvinistic confession in their 39 articles, and many French Huguenots had also come to the Western world. Thus we see that about 2/3 of the colonial population had been trained in the school of Calvin. Never in the world's history had a nation been founded by people such as these.